Across the famous Willamette River from the downtown area of Portland stands a stretch lined with old warehouses and various commercial structures. With the onset of bridges crossing the river, numerous lengthy overpasses were built and now run over this area, almost making it appear non-existent to those who travel above it. But once upon a time, before these overpasses and the mass changes in structures and what they are primarily used for in this area was, well, modestly different. In particular, the northeast corner of Morrison Street and Water Avenue is just a dirt patch with a battered fence around it, periodically overwhelmed by ivy growth. There's often graffiti of some kind in the vicinity of this corner. It's generally empty and meaningless. But back in 1922, a small restaurant stood at this corner. One of its waitresses was a spunky and spry-looking 20-year-old named Helen Leary. Just getting by, working the grind like everyone else, Helen unexpectedly waited on a scruffy, bearded man with worn-down but kind eyes. He was around the age of 60 and looked clearly as though he'd experienced a great deal in life. And yet he had a pleasant demeanor about him. This man was named Cash Weir, known locally as Captain Cash Weir. Weir lived on a beat-up old houseboat that lingered along the Willamette, often docked in the vicinity of where Belmont Street would have passed through, meaning he would have been docked very close to where the Morrison Bridge crosses the river today. This put his home within a block or so of the restaurant where Helen Leary worked. Hence it was no surprise that he would visit that location. To Leary's surprise, the two hit it off quite well. In fact, so well that after only one meeting, Cash jubilantly exclaimed that he wanted to bring his son in to meet her. No confusion about the motives there. A short while later, Helen would meet Cash's son, Earl Weir, a modestly attractive man, hair slicked back, and almost a lost, seemingly uneducated look to his eyes. But as the story often goes, they fell in love. The stars aligned, and it seemed like a match made in heaven. Helen Leary and the Weirs. What a surprise, then, to open local newspapers in the city of Portland and discover a grisly story on the front page. Helen Leary had gone to local authorities and divulged a bizarre story complete with murder and abduction. For a brief while, around Christmastime 1922, Helen Leary and the Weirs were the rage of the city. So what happened? As Helen would tell it, it was September 23rd of that same year, and she had gone down to Cash's houseboat to meet up with Earl, with whom she'd been carrying on a relationship with for quite some time. Upon her arrival, she witnessed, via looking through a small hole on the boat that gave her a view inside, from the outside, Cash inside the boat with a young girl of about 15 years. Helen then watched in horror as Cash brutally murdered this girl. Earl came along a short while later and ultimately helped Cash dispose of this unknown girl's body. Having witnessed everything, Helen, by her own account, was kept practically as a prisoner for several months leading up to December 20th, when she had finally broken free and went to the police with her story. Simply put, the Weirs forced her to stay and be monitored on the houseboat so as to prevent her from doing exactly what she did, going to authorities. Her being held in captivity was the explanation given as to why these events had transpired some 3 months earlier without her going to the police. The story hit the papers and locals were shocked, in particular those who knew Cash Weir personally. The captain had a positive reputation in town as being a down-to-earth and warm-hearted sort, who always opened up his sea-battered houseboat to anyone who needed a place to stay, be it a teenage runaway, someone who'd been kicked out of their house, or even one of the endless number of transients who wandered about the city. The thought, then, that a young girl had been to his houseboat at that time, in and of itself, was not something to set off red flags for locals. He would open his doors up to anyone. It was impossible for most to believe that he was capable of murder. Even Cash himself practically laughed at the notion when he was taken into custody by police, casually pronouncing his innocence. Or rather, he laughed uproariously when he was arrested, expressing that Helen Leary was just no good, and that she was simply seeking out revenge against him for telling his son not to waste his time with her. This was intriguing, considering Cash was responsible for the two of them meeting in the first place. Things must have gone awry rather quickly. Cash's son Earl was not quite as downbeat, nor as easily accessible. It just so happened that when Helen's story came to light, he was nowhere to be found. As the pilot of a boat known as the Clatsop, which he would frequently take up and down the Willamette and Columbia rivers, he honestly could have been anywhere. His easy access to a boat also led to immediate rumors that, in the aftermath of the disposing of the victim, that he may have split town by way of the sea. But before Earl could ultimately be tracked down and his story and actions assessed, there was a lot to unravel in terms of his experience and interaction with Helen Leary. As her story unraveled, Helen expressed that things all began around 2 p.m. on September 23rd. She traveled down to Cash's houseboat, docked in its usual spot, approximately where Belmont Street would hit the river. She had plans to get together with Earl that day and half expected him to be there on the boat. When she arrived, however, she saw no one but a 15-year-old girl loitering in the vicinity of the houseboat. When they encountered, Helen said the girl asked if she could stay with her, as she had recently run away from home and had nowhere to go, likely presuming, with her presence there, that Helen lived on the houseboat. Helen responded in the negative before leaving, planning on returning later in the hopes that Earl would be around. Several hours later, at approximately 7 p.m., Helen returned to the houseboat. As she proceeded down a patchy stretch of steps down by the water, she suddenly heard loud yelling inside the houseboat. She pondered if, perhaps, a raucous party was going on, possibly annoyed that she hadn't been invited. But unsure exactly what she was walking into, she approached the houseboat cautiously. She crept up beside a window which had no curtains to cover it. As she glimpsed inside, she saw there only Cash and the unnamed 15-year-old girl she had seen there earlier. She must have hung around until Cash came home and then asked him if she could stay. Helen then noticed that some of the girl's clothes had apparently been torn away from her body. Quickly, Helen put the pieces together and realized the yelling she'd heard was not the yells of fun, but rather an argument that had been taking place. It clearly appeared to her that Cash was in the process of taking advantage of this young girl in the worst of ways. She quickly ducked away from the window and out of sight. Considering the fact that the houseboat was bruised and battered from years and possibly decades on the sea, one of its many defects was a small hole in the wall just to the left and below the window that Helen had been looking through. She could glance through that small hole inside without anyone knowing she was there. As she stared through the hole for a few seconds, she suddenly found herself distracted by a noise. She glanced off and saw Earl approaching in the darkness. Helen fled from the area of the hole and ducked down where Earl couldn't see her, as he came aboard and entered the houseboat. With both Weirs inside with the young girl, Helen quickly returned to the hole to stare inside and watch as the two men murdered the young girl in cold blood. What was so intriguing about this claim on Helen Leary's part is that during a time where newspapers did whatever they could to snag readers, meaning when there was a graphic murder case to report on, they gave at least most of the grisly details. And yet, in the case of this story, the whole method of how the young girl was killed was mostly left in mystery. They reported on the hole. They reported on the girl's clothes being ripped off. They even reported on the boat's sudden departure afterwards. But when it came to the killing itself, these details were kept in check. The girl had simply been murdered. One local paper went so far as to call it an orgy of death, but then still did not provide any details. Was she stabbed, shot, bludgeoned? The general public didn't know, and were generally left in the dark on this matter. When the matter of death was first reported on in a paper, it was expressed that they had beaten the girl to death with a large, blunt object. After the killing, Helen stated that Earl began wrapping the girl up, and shortly after that, they set sail onto the Willamette, traveling north in the direction of where the river ended, at the Columbia River. The implication here was clear. They were taking the body way upstream and out of town where they could deposit the body somewhere, likely more rural and where nobody would see them do it. As the houseboat began to speed away, Helen fled the scene in an emotional flurry, running straight home. She stayed there all through the night and the next day, not leaving, just sitting there, bewildered and traumatized by what she had seen. Conveniently, she added, Earl never showed up for their planned date that night, obviously, as he was too busy helping his father get rid of a corpse. However, the following day, as Helen stayed home, he suddenly arrived at her place. He was nervous and shaky, frequently picking up various items in her place, holding them for a few seconds before dropping them again, and a few seconds later, picking up something else. He was clearly a scatterbrained wreck, and all Helen could do after his arrival was sit on her bed and cry. Finally, she just said it. "Earl Weir, why did you kill that girl?" Suddenly, Earl turned to her and rushed her, wrapping his hands around her throat and putting her up against a wall as he whispered sternly, "Don't shout so loud. People will hear you." As he kept his hands firmly around her throat, barely allowing any air through, he warned Helen that he would kill her if she ever told anyone what had happened that night, before finally releasing her. Upon pulling his hands back from her neck, he then pushed her down onto the bed. The classic, abusive, 1920s young male. Admittedly, something troubled me right away going through Helen Leary's story that I couldn't shake. This was the fact that, by her own account, at the time of the murder she had managed to go unseen by both Cash and Earl. As far as they knew, she wasn't there at all. Helen made no implication that she had made her presence known at that time, nor that she had told them anything between the time of the murder and Earl's sudden arrival at her place the following night. So when Earl charged into her apartment, clearly knowing something was amiss, how did he know that Helen had been there? Sure, the young girl could have mentioned Helen had been there earlier that day, but that would have nothing to do with where she was when the murder happened. How did Earl become aware that she had been there at the time? It appears she did not make it known until after she had been sitting there crying for some time as he paced around nervously. Was it her sudden begging as to why he did it that alerted Earl for the first time? That still doesn't make sense, as Helen's telling of the story implied that he knew by the time he arrived there, and hence was so aggressive and hostile from the moment he arrived. This may have just been a small detail, possibly something Helen forgot to mention or clarify, or just something that was passively reported on in local papers. But still, based on how her story was reported, I personally could not find a solid explanation as to how Earl could have known Helen was there when the murder took place. Whatever the circumstances, Earl immediately went and told his father that Helen knew about the murder. To no surprise, the day after Earl's visit to Helen's apartment, she was graced with a visit from Cash himself. Like his son had the night before, Cash also paid Helen a little threat on her life, stating he would, quote, put her out of the way if she ever spoke about what she had seen. What then followed was several weeks of surveillance and harassment. Helen noted it was abundantly clear that neither Cash nor Earl felt that they could fully trust her to keep quiet, and thus it was rare in the coming days for one of them to not be close by. Finally, an ultimate act of desperation. On October 8th, approximately 2 weeks after the murder, both Cash and Earl lured Helen down to the houseboat, at which time they locked her inside, a prisoner. They raised the anchor and went out to sea. The anchor did not drop again until they were in the middle of the Willamette River, at which time they abandoned her there on the boat. She claimed she was left for some 4 days without any food when Cash suddenly returned, bringing her some sandwiches. Helen gave no explanation as to how Cash and Earl got back to shore after leaving the boat in the middle of the river. It also seems strange that, even in being anchored in the middle of the Willamette River, which is not a particularly wide river, especially in the downtown Portland area, that an endangered Helen Leary did not just jump into the river and swim to shore in an effort to escape. Maybe she was just too frightened. Maybe she couldn't swim. But after Cash's return on what would have been October 12th, based on her series of events, Helen was moved on to the houseboat down to the vicinity of Ross Island, a thin island in the middle of the Willamette just south of the downtown area. This location would be approximately 1.5 miles south from the houseboat's usual placement by Belmont Street. Left on an island, Helen was still in a place of captivity. But by this time, Cash brought in some help in the form of a few accomplices. These individuals were Chris Gruel, Dorothy Robertson, and Al Loomis. Gruel was simply described as a crippled wood peddler who lingered around Ross Island and was in the vicinity of the houseboat while it was there. He implied that he had heard about Helen's claims of witnessing a murder, but acted dumb as to where he had heard about it. As he actively helped the two men, she was making the claim against keeping her imprisoned on the houseboat. He also made sure to mention to authorities, after Helen's story came out, that he had done an assortment of little things to try and help her during her time of captivity. It seems like Chris Gruel was trying to play the sympathy card for himself in being disabled as a way to deflect from the fact that he had actively helped keep a woman trapped out at sea. Admittedly, again in her account of events, Helen did state that the one time she got off the houseboat was when Gruel willingly took her, as she was afraid to go alone for fear of what Cash or Earl might have done if they found her. She also made the claim that, while out with Gruel, they encountered a mystery man on a bridge who asked her directly if she was Helen Leary. When she responded affirmatively, the man merely repeated information that was already known. Cash was going to put her away if she spoke, and Cash was also determined to break up whatever love still existed between she and Earl. After this encounter, a frightened Helen begged Gruel to just take her back to the boat. This little piece of her story was another element that seemed at least mildly strange. It seemed unlikely that Helen would randomly encounter some stranger on a bridge who would know Cash and know who she was before making repeated threats. It's also a bit strange to me that Helen did not make an effort at this time to escape or bolt to the authorities. But again, perhaps she was just too frightened. Helen also spoke of at least one other time, a time in which she had not yet been locked on the houseboat. She stated this occurred roughly a week after the murder, putting it at around the start of October. She said she had been out driving with Earl, presumably in a more northern part of Portland, or possibly north of the city altogether. They were driving down a road in close proximity to the river. Helen could not recall the name of the road they traveled down, but it was presumably Highway 30, which angles north out of Portland and travels along the Columbia River, all the way up the Oregon Peninsula before finally ending at the town of Astoria, along the Oregon coast. I believe this as only a short while after Helen had reported what she knew to the police, they were searching in the vicinity of Linton, which is a small unincorporated area just north of northwest Portland along the Columbia River, and Highway 30 goes right through there. Whatever the actual road was, Helen claimed that as they drove along, Earl looked out the window towards the river and whispered passively that he could almost see the place where they had left the body. He then admitted that they dropped her in the river and used stones to weigh her body down, so she would hopefully never rise to the surface again. It appears then that Dorothy Robertson and Al Loomis's involvement was a little more personal, as they had actively been living on the houseboat during this time that Helen was being kept there, almost like full-time prison guards. Loomis was quite the shady character who, back in 1911, had gunned down a man named Billy Smith over a quarrel regarding Smith's ex-wife. By Loomis's telling of the story, Smith's wife had divorced him, but he was unwilling to let her go. The men had had multiple scuffles leading up to December 17th, 1911, when a pistol fight broke out, of which Loomis was the winner of, to a degree. Smith did not die, however. The fact that he lived played a critical role in Loomis not having to go to prison for the shooting. However, unlike the wavering accounts of Chris Gruel, Loomis was steadfast in claiming Helen Leary's story was an absolute fabrication, from the murder itself up to the point that he was fingered as being one of her, quote, guards. By Helen's account, a few days after her brief brush with freedom with Chris Gruel, she was gripped with fear as someone boarded the boat and attempted to gain entry. Helen simply laid still, hidden in the dark until this possible intruder left. However, it is likely that this was either Dorothy Robertson or Al Loomis, as the day after this, they arrived at the boat, alerting to Helen that they had been told by Cash Weir that they could stay on that boat, free of charge. More like free rent for doing a job, as it were. Even by Helen's account, she seemed to express that neither of these two had known about the murder she claimed to see. Perhaps they did know and were just playing stupid. But Helen claimed that one night, while she and Dorothy drank down a large amount of Dago red wine, she admitted out of an inebriated hostility of the murder that she had seen, of Cash Weir murdering a young girl and his son helping him get rid of the body. It's very difficult to fully understand the dynamics of the living situation between these three individuals, and how much Dorothy and Al knew, and how much they possibly felt for Helen, who was being put through this horrid and seemingly endless experience. One element that went generally unreported on, and yet one would figure was of severe importance, is exactly the circumstances that Helen Leary ultimately escaped her houseboat prison. I really couldn't find an honest-to-goodness explanation for how she got away, whether she just dove into the river and swam for it, or whether she just finally was released. But with this incredible story having suddenly come to light to law enforcement after Helen Leary had regained her freedom, law enforcement was on the go. They had two primary focus points as their investigation began. One was to establish some validation for this wild story, which started by tracking down Weir's houseboat, the purported crime scene. This was a rather easy feat, as the boat was found still down by Ross Island, where Helen had claimed to have spent much of the past several weeks. The second focus was to try and establish an identity for this murder victim. Little information was known about her other than her approximate age. Helen did state that, in their brief exchange, the young girl stated that she was a runaway from the state of Washington. She also stated that the young girl wore 2 rings on her fingers, both of which contained agates. Even with the claim by Helen, the list of possible victims spread out to multiple states other than just Washington. One of the primary girls considered as possibly being the victim was a 15-year-old from Tacoma, Washington by the name of Ellen Solander. Solander disappeared from her home on September 5, 1922, some 18 days before the victim in question appeared at Weir's houseboat. Newspapers reported that Solander, described as having brown hair and blue eyes, closely resembled the description of the girl that Helen had supplied police with. While authorities appeared to have a difficult time making contact with the Solander family, it was still expressed that it was believed after she fled home that Ellen Solander would have been heading for Portland. By December 23rd, her father, E.M. Solander, contacted authorities letting them know that Ellen was alive and well and currently in Seattle, Washington. While her family went searching for Ellen, they found her in the big city and discovered that she had left to start taking nursing courses at one of the hospitals there in Seattle. 2 other girls, both 18 years of age, by the names of Mary Kearns and Martha Quigley, had disappeared from Everett, Washington on August 8th, approximately a month and a half before the murder. Quigley was also described as having brown hair and blue eyes and matched fairly close to Helen's description of the girl she had met. However, Quigley was noticeably taller than the girl Helen said she had seen. Another 15-year-old by the name of Leon Lowe's had disappeared from her home in Gardena, a neighborhood in Los Angeles, California, and was briefly considered as possibly being the victim. However, girls like Lowe's were not taken as seriously as others since they were not from Washington. There was even a girl whose name was never reported in local papers, who had vanished from her home in Portland's Lentz neighborhood within a couple days of when Helen said the murder took place. Furthermore, while there were definite possibilities amongst these considered missing girls, authorities were a long way from making a serious identification, as they did not even know exactly where the body of the victim had been left. The search for Earl Weir was also becoming more and more critical to establishing what happened in this case, not just because he may have been involved, but because without him, it was a simple case of he said, she said, at least as long as no damaging evidence was being recovered. Officers searched the houseboat, but discovered little of any evidentiary value. Such made sense as, with the crime having occurred months earlier, a great deal of time had passed and it was unlikely anything would be there that would tie the Weirs to a murder, whether it happened or not. If it was to be believed that this runaway girl had just arrived on the scene at the houseboat on the same day that she was killed, this means she was there only a matter of a couple hours. It was also, obviously, only 1922, and crime scene investigation was rather primitive by today's standards. Had things like DNA analysis been a thing back in the 1920s, cases such as this would have been easier to validate. So while conventional wisdom suggested an all-out denial would be all that emanated from Earl Weir's lips, he was a possible witness and a possible accomplice, and his side needed to be known. Fortunately, it took only a little more than a day before Earl was apprehended. He was aboard the Cowlitz, which had docked briefly on the shore of the Columbia River, near the small town of Rainier, approximately 40 miles north of Portland, along Highway 30. When the tugboat docked ashore, authorities swooped in and arrested him. After his apprehension, he was quickly taken to the town of St. Helens, between Rainier and Portland, where he was first interviewed by officers of the law. Earl admitted to having heard about the accusations against he and his father only hours earlier when he saw the first reports on Helen's claims in the local newspapers. These newspapers also made it abundantly clear that authorities were looking for Earl, and yet he did not turn himself in. This was not a great start for Earl Weir, who was about to get a crash course in how not to conduct oneself, innocent or guilty, while in the process of being grilled by law enforcement. He was quick to claim his absolute innocence in the matter, claiming that if he had, in fact, been mixed up in some murder, that he played no part in it. This was also the information conveyed by investigators in St. Helens, as they were keeping mum about it to local newspaper reporters. But they did make sure to mention that after talking to Earl, that there were a good many discrepancies to his story. They were more than prepared to believe Helen Leary's story compared to the story given by the Weirs. After hours and hours of grilling and being forced to retell her details over and over again, Helen maintained the same story every time. There was not one slip-up in her story. The Weirs, on the other hand, would contradict themselves personally, while also contradicting each other. And when Earl, in particular, was not contradicting himself, he was, more often than not, answering questions on the murder with the same response. I don't know anything about this. An example of this was, while being questioned by authorities, Earl admitted that Helen had told him that the girl who was killed had come from Hood River, Oregon. This went in total contravention with Helen's claims that the girl said she was from Washington, but more importantly, after making this statement, Earl would deny any knowledge of anything. So what was it, Earl? While Cash maintained from the start that the whole motivation behind Helen's claims was to get him in hot water out of revenge for his efforts to separate her and his son, this was all news to Earl. Despite having the matter harped to him over and over again, Earl denied any knowledge that his father had been trying to break both he and Helen up. Then he dropped a bit of a bombshell, claiming that on September 28, 1922, only 5 days after the murder, both he and Helen had obtained a marriage license together. This was of great intrigue, as it threw Cash's whole explanation as to why Helen would make such slanderous claims against him out the window. It also made for a suspicious set of circumstances, with Helen agreeing to marry Earl only days after she witnessed him help kill a girl before arriving at her apartment and nearly choking her to death. She then married him before being taken out and locked up on the houseboat only 10 days later. If Earl were involved, there was an obvious possible motive as to why he would force a marriage with Helen. Despite the circumstances of the case, Helen made no qualms about how much she truly loved Earl, regardless. Earl likely knew this, and thus knew he could easily manipulate her into a marriage, since she probably wanted that anyway. Swearing out a marriage license together would certainly fly in the face of anything Helen chose to say about what she saw. And remember, by Helen's own account, in the days following the murder, the Weirs were both desperately keeping an eye on her and making threats against her if she spoke a word about what she saw. Obviously, they were worried about Helen opening her mouth. If she did end up saying something, it would be easy for Earl to say, "Well, then why did you marry me? A horrible killer. Only 5 days later." Why would she marry such a man? Despite Earl dropping this information, it did nothing to sway investigators on the matter, feeling he had pushed this marriage. It was also reported in a local paper that a wife testifying against her husband was an act that was extremely frowned upon, an action that often damaged one's credibility in and of itself. Earl's reasoning was that they should take out the license before moving in together, wherein they could see how well it worked out living together before they made an official decision to get married. How modern of the young Weir. What man in 1922 was openly admitting to trying to live with a woman before marriage, something that was drastically frowned upon by America's highly Christian society of the time? Living with someone before marriage was as blatant a sin as anything. If anyone was doing that, they certainly weren't going around bragging about it. In this vein, Earl's reasoning as to why they took out a marriage certificate was at least suspect. In a tense gathering, authorities decided to interview Earl and Helen together, when the interviewing of them separately had gotten authorities nowhere. Earl seemed relaxed, even in the presence of Helen. Whenever Earl's story did not sync with hers, he would just laugh at the accusations being made against him, as his father had also done. One could see this laughter as the calm, passive reactions to an absurd story that couldn't possibly be true, but on the other hand, maybe the Weirs were just complete psychopaths, unshaken by their actions, and unwilling to take responsibility for them. When the claims Helen made about passing near the site where the body of the victim had been left, and Earl stating that they had left the body there, he once more denied everything. "I never had no part in no murder, and if the old man did, I never knew nothing about it," Earl bluntly stated. Helen tried to respond to this with sensitivity. "Now, Earl, why don't you tell the truth about this? You know that you had a part in it, and that you threw the girl in the river after wrapping her in blankets." This is how Helen was quoted in local newspapers, granted, likely with some paraphrasing. Still in all, Helen's manner of speaking comes off to me as a little leading. She continued, trying to forge an admittance from Earl. "If this thing has haunted you like it has haunted me the last few months, you would tell right now. You must now have no conscience." And yet she still loved him dearly. Reportedly, Earl's only response to this statement was a smirking grin before calling the whole thing nonsense. Once more, Earl was not doing himself any favors. In addition to coming off as passive and arrogant in his interrogations, he also expressed no real concern for his father, stating that if his father did kill a girl, he deserved to be hung. While this process was not getting authorities much further in fulfilling an understanding of this case, if anything, it made them more sympathetic to Helen on the matter. Her story was also not shaky in the least. While not providing a possible motive himself as to why Helen would fabricate such a horrible lie, unlike his father, Earl also believed that this was recently constructed fabrication. This all implies that Helen's reasons for telling this story were a recent creation of hers. However, fracturing that perspective was a story told by Chris Gruel, again, the crippled man who stayed with Helen briefly on the houseboat. He stated that one night, after drinking too much, Helen told him something about the Weirs dropping a girl down. Due to his drunken state, he could not recall all of the details, but even he felt at the time that Helen was telling him about this particular murder. And this would have occurred back during the earlier part of October, some 2.5 months before Helen gave her story to the police. If such were true, then this was not a recent fabrication on Helen's account. Gruel also stated that he had heard the name of the victim and said her last name sounded like either Hawkins, Hopkins, or Calkins. Another interesting, if not totally useful, addition to the meek information available on the victim. Helen admitted that she could not recall the girl's name, meaning she was obviously given it when she met this mystery girl, making it strange that Gruel had narrowed down what her name sounded like. After all, Helen is the only one who could have told him the girl's name. What was equally intriguing was that he recalled this mystery girl had come from the Mount Scott-Lentz area in southeast Portland. This is gripping, if not potentially misleading, as, again, there had been reports out of the Lentz neighborhood of a young girl who had disappeared within days of when Helen said the murder took place. This may have just been a coincidence. Still, Gruel's story here was shaky, considering he couldn't recall all the details. This story likely accounted for why he told police initially that he felt he'd heard about the murder, but wasn't sure where from. But now he was being a little more forward with those details. He also recovered, so to speak, the memory of Helen having also told him that Earl had murdered a 15-year-old girl and dropped her down a sewer hole. This did not sync with the ongoing presumption that Cash and Earl took the body way down river on the boat and tossed it into the river, weighing it down with rocks. And while Gruel, to a degree, served to benefit Helen's case, he expressed that Helen also had a dark side that authorities were not aware of. He claimed that during his brief time with Helen, she had menaced him while drunk. It seemed one story could not pass with regards to Helen Leary that did not include alcohol. But then again, it was 1920s Portland. Gruel claimed on one occasion that Helen had chased him around the boat, waving an axe around madly. Pretty troubling considering the fact that Gruel was disabled and likely had a difficult time getting away from her. He also claimed that Helen taunted both Cash and Earl over her knowledge of the murders, holding it over their heads, almost as a seeming threat of blackmail. This certainly didn't jibe with the narrative that had been presumed to this point, that Helen had been subjected to threats, abduction, and torment for months. But this account suggested that Helen was an aggressor in the case, just as much as the Weirs were. This whole case had gone from shocking to truly bizarre, and it was only going to get crazier from here. By the end of December 21st, 1922, it had been about a day and a half since Helen Leary's tragic and troubling account of murder most foul, perpetrated on a youthful runaway, and honestly, little ground had been gained. The idea of placing Earl and Helen in the same room together to try and get somewhere on the case, in terms of their stances on the matter, did not change things much. Certainly Helen had a fairly strong story in that she had been unwavering in her account, while Cash and Earl again simply chuckled or pled ignorant to most questions. Popular opinion was steadily on Helen's side, if nothing more than out of disdain for the Weirs' passive attitudes that had no place in a murder investigation. December 22nd would see a drastic change in everything. A change in Helen's oh-so-perfect story, as well as law enforcement's actions regarding Cash and Earl Weir. First off, a little assistance was granted via nefarious means by a desperate police force, who left Earl and Helen together for another period of time together. However, this time the police made the inference that they were going to leave the two young, conflicted lovers alone. Little did Earl and Helen realize that the police were still eavesdropping on them, hoping the solitude might lead to deeper honesty and perhaps an admission between the two. According to nearby listening officers, as the two sat alone, Helen pushed for conversation, posing a question to Earl. "Why did you say, when you were arrested at Rainier, 'Have they found the body?'" To this Earl responded with, "I wanted to find out if they'd got the goods on me." Simply put, this was mostly an admission on Earl's part. At least, it was an admittance that he knew more about the case than he let on, and that he was concerned about the police busting him. His whole "I know nothing" gimmick appeared to be just that. Of course, by this time, the police were desperate for forward motion in the case, especially with Cash Weir's lawyer making a big push to have him released from custody. So did they really hear this blatant admission from Earl Weir, or were they just doing a little fabricating themselves to get some goods on Earl? The only ones who knew for sure were those officers sitting nearby. As the conversation continued on, officers claimed to hear Earl pressuring Helen to repudiate her story. He was reportedly heard to say, "There is only one way out of your story. Say you were drunk and didn't know what you were talking about. That'll let you free, too." Helen replied, "I couldn't do that. Then I'd have to go to the Cedars." I'll admit right off, I have no clue what is meant by Cedars in Helen's quote. Maybe that was in reference to some kind of convent or religious location where she'd have to go to beg forgiveness for committing lies and deception. That's just one thought. I cannot say for certain, and I could not find in search exactly what this meant. Earl's pleasure for her to reverse her story are interestingly worded, especially for a man who felt he was alone with Helen. For a guy who willingly helped his father dispose of a murder girl's body, and who attacked and threatened Ellen repeatedly afterward, as the two sat here alone, Earl not only asked her to alter her story, but asked her to alter her story in such a way that would get her off the hook as well. It's a wonder. To this point, Earl had been given off vibes that, like many men of that time, he'd had an off-and-on relationship with Helen, but when it came down to reality, he was looking out for himself more than anything. And now he was suddenly equally as concerned about Helen getting off for all of this as he was for himself. The conflicts in this case and the behavior of those involved was becoming completely scatterbrained. After a period in which the two were reportedly speaking to each other softly, wherein the officers nearby could not make out what they were saying, Helen then broke the softness by speaking out loud and high, "You know yourself the girl was murdered in that houseboat. You were there. Why do you deny it?" There was a pretty obvious answer to that question, if in fact Earl was guilty. Earl responded bluntly, You don't suppose I'd say to the police, "Oh yes, I did it," do you? They'll have to prove it. And anyway, I ain't gonna make no spiel. Again, not words of absolute admittance, but some fairly damning dialogue. Earl never openly said he was responsible, but it was obvious that he was concerned he would go down for this and hoped there would be no further evidence that came to light to put him in a worse place than he already stood. Of course, when it was brought to Earl's attention later on that his conversation with Helen had been overheard, he maintained his sense of arrogant ignorance, denying any involvement in the matter. Regardless of this slight shift, the Weir's chances of going free had dwindled down to nothing. Complaints were officially filed against Cash Weir and a charge of murder in the first degree, while further charges were made against Earl Weir as an accessory after the fact. This may have been a bit shocking to some, as the body had not even been recovered for a victim who was still unidentified. Technically, there was no concrete evidence a murder had taken place. Nonetheless, the police and even the district attorney's office were convinced such had taken place and that they likely had the guilty parties in the Weirs. These official charges just happened to occur only 30 minutes after Cash's attorney, E.R. Lundberg, had filed a writ of habeas corpus in an attempt to free his client. In all fairness, Cash had been kept in police custody since the evening of December 20th, meaning he had been kept by this point for nearly 2 days without so much as a charge made against him. To help fend off any criticism against authorities for holding someone much longer than legally allowed, Deputy District Attorney John Mowry was in municipal court making the charges official. The victim in the crime, Jane Doe. Regardless what had happened, Cash and Earl Weir were likely no longer laughing. The next planned wheel to go into motion was to establish a grand jury, and the district attorney's office wanted those proceedings to begin as quickly as possible. Along with the Weirs, Helen Leary was being kept as a material witness, along with Dorothy Robertson, Al Loomis, and an R.E. Brown, another individual who presumably knew information about the case and the holding of Helen on the houseboat afterward. But almost as quickly as the Weirs were officially charged with the murder, it appears Helen Leary was first discovering the true implications of her actions. Certainly no one could blame her for reporting what she knew and bringing what would have otherwise been a perfect crime, the unknown murder of an unknown victim, to the attention of law enforcement. But, without mincing words, she was still madly in love with Earl Weir, accomplice or no. And while his charge as an accomplice only carried a 1 to 5 year sentence, such was 1 to 5 years that Helen would be apart from him. And while Helen Leary had come out with her story and had stuck to it, she was still clearly a very emotional and reactive person who was likely to crumble to pieces over losing the love of her life, and even more so, losing him due to her own actions. The dam had begun to crack just after the charges were filed against Cash and Earl. Within hours of this action, Helen admitted lies in her story for the first time. Not mistakes, not misunderstandings, but lies. She stuck to her story's core elements, but made a critical addition. This addition did correlate to other accounts given, even by Earl, who claimed to have seen that Cash was given a black eye in the time around when the murder took place. In Helen's new telling of events, she did not run and hide, but rather, upon her checking into the houseboat through the hole in the wall, she actually entered the houseboat after discovering Cash with the girl, already dead. She called him out for his homicidal actions, at which time he struck her in the face. She responded by punching back at him, administering him the black eye he was seen with afterward. After this attack, she fled from the houseboat, at which time Earl was approaching from near Belmont Street. She raced to him and accompanied him back to the houseboat after telling him what had happened. She still maintained that Earl helped Cash wrap the dead body up in blankets before leaving to deposit the body. If this addition to her story was true, it's a wonder why she left it out. Perhaps if she admitted that she had actually been on the boat, up close and personal to the crime, she may have feared that she would have also been charged to some degree. But other than that, it seemed rather clear that Helen was trying to find some common ground between telling the truth and trying to help Earl. In this retelling, she separated him a little more from what had happened, but she still kept all the details in that made him an accomplice, exactly what he was being charged for. To no real surprise, this alteration in Helen's story was actually used to bolster the case against Earl and his father. So in summation, when the Weirs made conflicting statements, it was evidence of their deception and guilt. But when Helen admitted to lies and alterations in her story, she was deemed even more believable. Anything to get the case before a grand jury. The primary investigator on the case even went so far as to claim that Earl admitted to going to the houseboat, going inside with Helen and seeing his father's black eye, but nothing else. However, this abrupt shift to Helen's story seemed to suddenly elicit a partial confirmation from the otherwise tight-lipped younger Weir. They also stated that Earl admitted that his father left in his houseboat that night, but he did not accompany his father, nor did he know where his father was going or why. If he was still denying any knowledge of a murder having happened that night, or anything else that may have been extremely traumatizing, it's surprising that around Christmas, Earl would be able to specify September 23rd, almost 3 months later, as the particular night he remembered his dad traveling away on his houseboat, especially considering the fact that in the weeks to follow, that same houseboat was doing a lot of back and forth traveling. With regards to the assumed killer, Cash Weir, who had oddly been discussed very little in this piece, as he was often not the focal individual discussed in many newspaper articles on the case, the police did their best to investigate him thoroughly and try to find anything to strengthen their case, especially now that they were about to take the case before a grand jury. In particular, an acquaintance of Cash told authorities that about 2 months earlier, making it sometime in October, that Cash had told him that he had lost the anchor from his boat recently. Multiple other witnesses who knew Cash personally stated that around the same time Cash had been looking around to get his hands on a new anchor, and in the meantime he'd been using an old chunk of cast iron as a makeshift one. While the lingering story was that Cash and Earl had thrown the blanket-wrapped victim over the edge into the water using rocks to weigh her down, a new theory that was being considered was that the anchor from Cash's houseboat was actually what was used to weigh down the victim's body as she was tossed overboard. Cash's admission of losing his anchor and looking for a new one within a few weeks of the murder only served to strengthen the case against him. Police were also working with the theory that the girl had not, in fact, passed away while on the houseboat, but had just been beaten into unconsciousness. She was either finished off later on, or, possibly, tossed into the river while still clinging to life. No explanation was given as to why the police thought this might have been the case. All they knew was they still needed to try and find that victim's body, if they were hoping for an eventual trial conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. Christmas Eve arrived, and Helen Leary was still an emotional basket case over her present circumstances and what they could mean for her love, Earl. She was trapped. To the shock and frustration of the district attorney's office, Helen visited Deputy District Attorney John Mowry with a question. What would the penalty be if she were to reverse her story? She had spent a mostly sleepless night, frantic over the future of her relationship with a man she was maybe about to send away to the pen. She openly admitted as such to Mowry as her motive for wanting to change her story, not that she was admitting that the story she told was a lie. Mowry asked bluntly, but if Cash Weir committed the crime, and his son Earl helped him dispose of the body in the river, who do you wish to change your story and save him? Helen batted her eyes dramatically before responding, because I love Earl and do not wish to see him hanged. She obviously had not been told that he was only facing a couple years in prison. Mowry shifted gears, hoping to strike at Helen's emotional common sense. After all he has said about you and your character, how can you say you love him? Helen glanced off and responded equally as blunt. I am very forgiving. She still maintained that Cash Weir was a murderer, in cold blood. She was just desperate for a way to get justice for one and forgiveness for the other. Certainly, at least some of her feelings were tainted by the manipulative beast of love, leaving her in a place rife with trying to do the right thing and looking out for her own ideas of happiness. I have always thought a great deal of Earl, she said, and I am sorry to have caused him all this trouble. I thought over my story and, at length, decided that I could retract my story and we could all be let out. Mowry was direct in his response. He just wanted the truth. If what you say is true, we want to know it. If you're lying, we want to know that. Helen Leary found herself in a tight and seemingly inescapable place. To the novice, she must have been so overwhelmed by finally getting the opportunity to step forward and tell her story that she did not think of the repercussions against Earl until those severe repercussions truly began with his indictment. Not only was Helen, bit by bit, making the potential prosecution's case more and more difficult, she was setting herself up suddenly as an unreliable witness. The woman whose story was unwavering after hours of police grilling now appeared to be setting herself up to say just about anything at the trial proceeding. She would obviously be the star witness at trial, and what if, when she was called to the stand, she suddenly snapped and denied everything in a complete breakdown just to save Earl's freedom? Not only would the trial end there, but the prosecution would be made an absolute laughingstock for taking such a case to court based almost solely on the account of such an erratic witness. Suddenly it was becoming a little more difficult to honestly think that Cash Weir and his son were going to be charged for the heartless taking of one's life, whereas only 24 hours earlier, the case seemed to be all but in the bag. But if the district attorney's office thought this was difficult, they were not going to be very happy with the Christmas present they were about to receive. Christmas Day, 1922. An anonymous letter was received by the city's police department from a woman who identified herself simply as Jane Doe. When the letter was opened, the writer expressed that she was keeping her identity hidden because she did not want her family to get mixed up in the Cash Weir murder case. This was the most docile thing she had to say. Whoever wrote the letter expressed that she had been in Portland in September and had met Helen Leary personally outside of Cash Weir's boat. One newspaper even stated that the girl who wrote the letter claimed that Helen had mistreated her during their brief encounter, but more than anything else, she sought to exonerate Cash Weir from any wrongdoing, as she was still clearly the victim and very much alive. A Christmas present for the ages. The police immediately sought to set up a private meeting with the individual who wrote the letter so as to fully verify it without bringing the girl's family any unwanted attention. They already believed on the outset that the letter was credible. They believed it so much that both the police as well as the district attorney's office immediately began to question Helen's story in its entirety. The simple fact of the matter was that there was still no body or any definitive evidence that anyone had been killed, and now the murder victim in question had just written a letter verifying that she was alive. John Mowry's perspective had been so rapidly changed by these recent events that he even reported to a local newspaper his perspective regarding Helen's story, and his claims were practically identical to what Cash Weir had been saying from day one. He felt Helen had made up the story as a way to seek out revenge against the man trying to separate her from his son. These past 24 hours had been a wild circus of events, with the general opinion about Helen Leary shifting from sympathetic and reliable to, well, a young lady who may have just been a little crazy. Maybe she was just a woman scorned. Backed into the corner, Helen began to crack even more. While local papers were reporting the bombshell of an anonymous letter from the supposed murder victim, another brief article posted in the Statesman's Journal declared that Helen was willing to admit her whole story was in deception as long as Cash and Earl would agree to one thing. However, she was unwilling to tell authorities and the press what that one thing was. She said it was personal, with a bashful smile. The police inferred the one thing on the matter was likely Earl's agreement to marry her, and Cash's willingness to accept that. It made sense, almost as a form of blackmail. She'd take back the story, give the two men their freedom, as long as she got what she wanted, more than anything. The following day, December 26th, the day after Christmas, Helen Leary finally gave in to the suspicions. She had fabricated the whole story. As her story had slowly been coming apart, and she was on the verge of having nothing more to say than the fact that she was a great liar, the final domino fell. While not being known about by investigators during the roughly 5 days between Helen's first telling of her story and her story coming under fire, a George Vinstead came forward. A critical witness, he said that he had rented out Cash Weir's houseboat, and the night he had rented it out just happened to be on September 23rd, the night of the murder. Vinstead stated he had been on the boat until about 8 p.m. that night before heading out. This would put him on the boat at the time Cash and the murder victim were there. But Vinstead said he was there alone. Cash wasn't there. No mysterious 15-year-old girl. No Helen Leary. Had Vinstead been discovered earlier, this whole wild string of events, for the most part, would have never happened. The officers who were in her presence that day must have felt it a day wasted, as earlier on that day, before the revelation of this anonymous letter and Helen's recantation of the whole thing, these officers had taken Helen on a drive, mostly along the Columbia River, hoping to find the spot she claimed Earl told her was where they left the girl's body. All that driving around, only to return to the station to the news that they were searching for a ghost. And what was equally useless in the broad scheme of things was when Helen finally made officers stop at a certain spot along the Columbia River. They were reportedly in the vicinity of Salvie Island, just north of Portland, where she pointed out a general spot that she said was where the girl had been tossed into the river's dark waters. The officers, along with her, searched the general area for about 30 minutes, turning up nothing. Desperate, Helen even made a claim during this trip that only a couple days after the murder occurred, Cash took her in his houseboat upstream along the Willamette River and into the Columbia to the spot where they'd reportedly left the body. According to Helen, Cash's specific reason for making the trip was to check and see if the body had resurfaced or stayed deep beneath the water. But as Helen made the trip with the officers down Highway 30 from the vicinity of Sylvie Island back into the heart of Portland, the officers noticed her somber demeanor, which she had maintained most of the trip, suddenly slipped into a state of laissez-faire as she relaxed and even began to chuckle. For whatever reason, she had briefly broken free from the sadness and despair of the past couple of days, and seemed calm, cool, and gathered. It was then, out of the blue, she blurted out to the officers that the whole story was a lie. She'd made it all up, and that was the beginning of the end. I hated Cash Weir and loved his son. That's all. With the cat out of the bag, the officers stayed quiet, hoping Helen would continue talking and unveiling more, and to their luck, she did just that. "Oh, I got drunk one night and thought of this, I guess," she passively said as she stared out the window, watching the rural north of Portland gradually fade back into the modern civilization of the city. "I was drunk when I first thought of it, and drunk when I first started to talk about it. There never was any murder, nor any 15-year-old girl in the houseboat for the matter. In all fairness, there was a 15-year-old girl in the vicinity that day. She just never died. Maybe it was a different day, but clearly, Helen had had some encounter with some 15-year-old girl near the houseboat at some point. Those likely all were factors in leading to her creation of this story. It must have been bewildering to the officers in the car as they watched this young woman shift from emotional state to emotional state, almost as if everything that happened to that point never mattered, like none of her actions had had any effect on anyone. It was just a joke, a fun little drunken joke. Once again, Helen Leary never seemed to have much of a story when there wasn't alcohol involved. She'd almost seemed to have broken free of reality. She even reportedly told officers, not long before admitting everything was a lie, that she had actually been directly involved herself as an accomplice in the murder. At least that's what the December 27th, 1922 edition of the Oregon Daily Journal stated. Later in the day, between admitting to her lies to these officers and ultimately admitting the same to the police lieutenant later on, Helen was quick to flip the switch. Suddenly the story was not a lie. Again. In fact, she had a little more information on the murder victim, of whom she remembered the girl's actual name as being Betty, and that she had black hair. Upon being grilled again, she got frustrated and once again admitted it was all a lie. She then stated she only admitted it was a lie because she was tired of all the questions. But her story was still true. Lies. Truth. Lies. Truth. This young lady was truly all over the place. As quickly as Helen had repudiated her story, for the second or third time, John Mowry went before the municipal court on an order to dismiss all charges against Cash and Earl Weir. It was truly bizarre. For days, law enforcement, as well as the rest of the city, had become more and more convinced that these two men were guilty for a murder that never even happened. It was truly one of the most bizarre murder cases, if you can call it that, in the history of Portland, and one of few wherein there was never actually a murder. Cash Weir ruined my life, and that is the reason I told this lie and tried to get him in trouble, Helen spoke unsteadily to detectives, in essence proving Cash's claim absolutely correct about her motives. He made an immoral woman out of me. Before I met him, I was a good girl. Then, one night, I met him at a downtown restaurant, and he invited me down to his houseboat. I didn't realize what I was getting into, but it was too late. It really started that easily, at a small restaurant at the corner of Southeast Morrison and Water, a spot that's just a battered field surrounded by tangled-up fencing. A chance encounter that led to claims of brutality and murder. The story on page 1 for Portland's 1922 Christmas season. Knowing the jig was up, it should have been of no surprise that Helen still put the blame entirely on Cash for everything that had happened. None of it was actually Helen's fault. It was the fault of the overbearing father who used his powers to alter Helen's very being, ultimately driving her to such drastic and, by her words, immoral actions. She nearly ruined 2 men's lives, but it was not her fault in the slightest. She still even felt there was some justification in her actions, or at least a moral one to be taken away. Finally, cracking a smile with detectives, she expressed, "I think this will be a good lesson to him anyway. Don't you? He won't ruin any more girls." Oddly enough, after Helen finally and definitively maintained that her story was a fabrication, the police began to question the validity of this anonymous letter they had received. They even began to question whether it had been written by a woman, feeling like, based on the style of handwriting, it had likely been written by a man. This leads me to believe the handwriting was somewhat on the chicken scratch side because, after all, only men have bad handwriting, sarcasm implied. I never saw a full resolution to this anonymous letter situation or whether the identity of the person who penned it was ever established. But by the end of December 26th, it didn't matter, because it had been established there was no murder to investigate anymore. And after dealing with the roundabout nature of Helen Leary, the people were likely exhausted and weary of pursuing another possible liar in the form of an anonymous letter writer. Whatever the case, it's still interesting, as this letter seems to have been the final thing that pushed Helen over the edge, and in the end it may have not even been valid. Another lie just may have finally gotten Helen Leary to admit she had done the same. And why did Cash and Earl behave the way they did in the face of law enforcement? The police figured it was just hubris on their part. They knew the whole thing was nonsense, and they decided to enjoy the drama, knowing it would all eventually come apart. Maybe they had a good time through it all. But in the end, they only helped elongate the beliefs by police that Helen Leary's story was true. Even when Earl was alone with Helen, being listened to by police, he was still just playing around with everyone. Hence his various statements that, at least partially, seemed to suggest his guilt. Authorities noted, in particular, one statement they overheard between Earl and Helen that may have sounded like another partial admittance of guilt, but was really, presumably, just a man fooling with the system. Helen was heard to ask him why he didn't immediately ask authorities when he was arrested whether they had found a body or not. Earl casually replied, "Because I wanted to see them produce the goods." These were goods that Earl knew they'd never make good on. Cash and Earl Weir, like Helen Leary, were an odd bunch. One of the strangest and kookiest criminal cases in recent memory had come and then ended in its entirety in less than a week, and it was all the creation of one woman's mind. But was it merely for revenge, spurred on by a night of too much drinking, that brought this all about? Helen Leary had become an enigma to all law enforcement in the city of Portland. In rescinding her story, Helen may have felt she could just slip back into everyday life, hoping that Earl would forgive her and, in fact, marry her. During this time, she had been spoken to and analyzed by a Multnomah County psychologist, Dr. S.C. Coase, who, after her admission of fabricating the whole story, put forward his personal depiction of Helen's psychological state, and the doctor did not mince words. As published in the Oregon Daily Journal on December 29, 1922, Dr. Coase stated, "She is 20 years old, of sub-average intelligence, and although she is not subject to delusions or hallucinations, and presents no symptoms of dementia praecox or hysteria, there are definite indications of a constitutional psychopathy, and she may be classified as a pathological liar. She is subject to criminalistic and mental imagery, or what is commonly interpreted by the lay mind as periodic sullenness or moodiness. Pathological lying is generally associated with an earlier history of running away from home, petty larceny, filthy language, and considerable sex delinquency. In moral discrimination, she is egocentric, with little realization of the profound social effects of her behavior." Dr. Coase simply called her a, quote, "natural liar," unquote. This was certainly a mouthful in terms of describing Helen Leary, as she was, down to her core. Certainly there appears to be a few elements of archaic 1920s psychopathy mixed in with Dr. Coase's words, but that certainly doesn't dissuade from the final focal conclusion being that Helen Leary was a pathological liar and also, potentially, psychopathic. Her potential for psychopathy certainly had substance to it, as she clearly lacked empathy for others in terms of the effects of her actions. Of course, until she realized how much they affected Earl Weir specifically. But even then, her drastic efforts to try and get him off, while still claiming his father was a killer, could have been more about her getting what she wanted than genuinely caring about Earl and his circumstances. Psychopathy, or at least something like it, would explain how she could so callously try and ruin a man's life with deception, and even how she ultimately admitted to making the whole thing up to a few officers, while in the midst of a light-hearted moment. The fact that she almost treated it like a funny joke, that she was only too proud of herself, and that she nearly pulled it off, clearly showed a break in reality of some kind, and a clear lack of concern for the effect her actions had on others. Yep, tragically, Helen Leary was just a youthful crackpot who led local law enforcement on a merry and misguided chase for justice that did not even exist. But it was the Weirs who truly had the last laugh. After chuckling their way through police custody, the two were officially released on December 27, 1922, with a complete dismissal of the charges that had been levied against them. They regained their liberty and were allowed to go on with life as it had been beforehand. It's hard to say if such was the same for Helen Leary, who had become the flavor of the week in Portland, only to fade away so briskly in embarrassment. After the conclusion of 1922, the three main pieces in this bizarre puzzle fell off the face of the earth, or rather were no longer the subjects of fare deemed intriguing enough to appear in anyone's local papers, at least as far as I could find. That's usually the case for forgotten cases, such as this. For a while they are everything, but when the dust settles, they just become a couple faces mixed into the thousands and thousands living in the city. A battered houseboat floats down the Willamette, catching nobody's attention. A young woman serves a couple at a table in a small restaurant down by the river, who have no idea who she is, even after reading the name Helen on her uniform. So much happens in the world, and it's practically impossible to stay focused on one event forever when so many more are happening. For a brief moment, this story was everything. And no, there's not so much as a brief summation by a random amateur historian such as myself, besides myself, about this case. It lays there dormant like so many others, a spirit trapped in a buried casket, just awaiting the potential moment that its memory might, if just for a moment, spring back to life and into the minds of another generation. Those are the stories I love the most.